So, dobry večer, everyone. Good evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is Jen Budny, and I am the new executive director at the Ukrainian Museum of Canada. I started here in May, and as some of you may know, we're an all-new team here at the museum, and we're really excited to be hosting our first online lecture this evening. The Ukrainian Museum of Canada is a network of museums founded in the first half of the 20th century by the Ukrainian Women's Association of Canada. So our headquarters are here in Saskatoon in Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. And we have branches in Toronto on the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. In Winnipeg on Treaty 1 territory and the heartland of the Métis. In Edmonton, which like Saskatoon is in Treaty 6, in Calgary on Treaty 7 territory, and in Vancouver, which is situated on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. So I'm really, really grateful that we are able to gather together from across Turtle Island using this technology called Zoom. This is, as I mentioned, the first live online lecture that we have done from our Saskatoon location. And we're really thrilled to have Dr. Sarah Beaulieu speaking to us on the archaeology of internment at the Morrissey WWI camp. As most of you probably know, the World War I internment camps saw more than 8,500 individuals, mostly of Ukrainian origin, but also German, Bulgarian, Turkish, and other nationalities and ethnicities, interned at camps across Canada between 1814 and 1820. Of course, the internments impacted exponentially more people than those who were actually interned. It's helpful, in my opinion, to understand the camps as part of a British imperial strategy that affected people globally, not just here in Canada. In Canada, the internment camps were managed by somebody named William Dillon Otter. He was a colonel, and he's often regarded as Canada's first true professional soldier. Before being put in charge of Canada's internment camps in World War I, he assisted General Frederick Middleton on the advance on the Métis stronghold of Batoche here in Saskatchewan, and he also led the attack on Poundmaker's forces on Cut Knife Hill. So while we hope that our ongoing explorations of the World War I internments can be part of a still necessary recognition and healing process for Ukrainian Canadians, it's my hope that it can also be part of our journey as Ukrainian Canadians towards reconciliation. As we see with the camps, we've been victimized by the colonizing process, but as an ethnic group that is largely assimilated, we've also benefited from this system in ways that communities that are still governed by the Indian Act and related colonial policies have not. I want to acknowledge that our talk tonight is inspired by one of our current exhibitions, Pause in Plight, by Winnipeg artist Carrie Parnell. This exhibition explores the political and social environment in which the internment camps were made acceptable to Canadians, as well as the unique experiences of certain real individuals at that time. Carrie's show is supported by the Endowment Council of the Canadian First World War Internment Recognition Fund and the Shevchenko Foundation. So we're grateful for their support, as well as the ongoing support of the City of Saskatoon, SaskCulture, and all of our many members and donors. Before I introduce our guest, I want to say that Dr. Beaulieu will speak for about 45 minutes, and we will have time for questions at the end. If you have questions, no matter what time it is in the talk, you can write them in the chat box, and we will ask them at the end of Dr. Beaulieu's talk. The chat box, if you don't know, is at the bottom of your screen. You hit chat, and a box with text will pull up on the right-hand side of your screen. Or you can ask your questions live at the end. You can put up your hand, and so we can see you and unmute you. Dr. Sarah Beaulieu is an assistant professor in the School of Culture, Media, and Society at the University of the Fraser Valley. She received both her master's and her PhD from Simon Fraser University, with a research focus in modern conflict anthropology, which is a discipline that I had not heard of until I read about her work. Dr. Beaulieu is the first to have excavated World War I internment sites in Canada. I'm not going to say too much about her many accomplishments. You can find her full bio on our website, and it is very impressive. But I do think she will be talking tonight about some of the very interesting things that she has done with her research. She has a reputation, Dr. Beaulieu has a reputation for being able to interpret radar scans in a way that is both culturally sensitive and follows traditional cultural protocols. So she's not only excavated World War I internment sites, but she's liaised with the RCMP in search of clandestine graves. She's worked for First Nations communities to survey both Indigenous cemeteries and search for residential school burial sites. This field of modern conflict anthropology is something that many people, probably like me, haven't heard of before. Dr. Beaulieu has described her work as an effort to bring to light the stories of and give voice to the disenfranchised groups that have been overlooked in the historical record. So I know we're going to learn a lot from her talk tonight, and I want to thank her for joining us this evening. I'm very much looking forward to Dr. Beaulieu's talk, and I want to welcome her now to take the mic, so to speak.
Thank you so much. It feels like such a privilege to be here for the Ukrainian Museum of Canada's first inaugural, I would say, online presentation. So this is very exciting. I'm just going to share my screen so that we can start and move all of this over. So when I first began this research into internment camps, gosh, almost basically a decade ago now, I realized that there were very few surviving records. Historians had mined the archives. There was very little else that we were going to find out that way. There were also no living internees to speak directly to the history. Mary Manco Haskett was the last surviving internee, and she passed away at the age of 98 in 2007. And so that I felt, coming in as an archaeologist, we could uncover the physical aspects, the physical evidence of these camps to either corroborate or counter, what little was left behind by the historical record. I'm going to start with a quote from a gentleman. He was a descendant internee that I interviewed at the very, very beginning of this research, a decade ago now. And he said to me, when he was a child, he had asked his mom where she was born. And when she replied, she said, "I was born in a little village just outside of Montreal." So of course, being a nice guy of Kincaid, I could see this little village. There was snow on the roof. There were yellow windows, smoke coming out of the chimney. And then I find out that she was born in a concentration camp, in a tar paper shack in the middle of nowhere. And he was really shocked by this. And this really stayed with me. It resonated with me. And after he said that, I realized that I was hooked, that this was research that was going to become part of my life's work, and that the field of archaeology could really contribute in a major way. And so in that moment, I decided that this was going to go on beyond a master's or graduate school, and continue on into the work that I am still doing today. So the Morrissey Internment Camp is the Canadian World War I internment camp, referred to in the historical record as a concentration camp, much because of the language of the Boer War. It was really concealed on the landscape, long forgotten in collective memory, and almost completely purposefully erased in history. So today I'll discuss and share with you the discipline of archaeology and how this can really support social justice by contributing invaluable information when there's a dearth of documentary evidence. And so I'll use the Morrissey World War I internment camp. We have since moved on, and we've been excavating in the Morrissey Internment Camp in the Morrissey Mountains just outside of Vernon, BC. But I'll use Morrissey Internment Camp for tonight's lecture to kind of touch upon the points and really further investigate the nature of erasure and deniability of internment, and also to redress this forgotten history. The sites of some of the most infamous prisons and concentration camps of the 20th century are now forest. Within a few short decades, the blink of an eye in archaeological terms, vast settlements have been lost by, and reabsorbed by their environments. So the question becomes, what are the archaeological implications if we can walk for miles across these sites, once home to hundreds, in Europe, thousands of prisoners, without even realizing it? And one of the most striking yet troubling features of internment sites is their physical ephemerality. The very term camp implies that it's a temporary structure. And this ephemerality really has been exploited by the perpetrators of internment camps the world over. To erase the physical traces of the camps is to erase them from history. Combined with the destruction of documentary evidence, it becomes all too feasible that a substantial episode of internment history can be erased and denied. And this erasure and denial really contributes to the shifting of public perceptions of internment history, which enable it essentially to be rewritten through the lens of any current political climate. There are four contributing factors that led to the almost complete historical erasure of Canada's internment camps, which include the Morrissey WWI internment camp. For one, there are no living survivors of the internment camps to speak to this story. However, even so, very few survivors and even the guards spoke about the ordeal of the internment operations once it shut down. In 1954, following World War II and the redress and subsequent compensation for Japanese internees, Canada destroyed the majority of the federal records pertaining to the World War I internment operations. And as I previously mentioned, the very nature and the physical ephemerality of the internment camps contributes to the erasure. So as a conflict anthropologist or a conflict archaeologist, we tend to apply three different lines of evidence into our research. There's an examination of the material culture record, of course, and we do this through excavation, through remote sensing, and whatnot. There's an archival analysis that we do. This is going through all of the historical documentation. There's the oral history, so the interviews with the descendant community. And this triangulation of data sets can complement other lines of research, especially when the historical record or the official literature really is deficient. So for the remainder of this talk, I'll provide you with further information pertaining to the Canadian internment operations as a whole, Morrissey Internment Camp specifically, and then I'll take you into the archaeological results. And finally, I'll bring you back to the social relevance of why this is so compelling today. Economic depression, fear, patriotism, prejudice led to Canada arresting 8,579 foreigners and interning them in 24 internment camps across Canada during the First World War. General Otter, as Jennifer mentioned, who was the head of the internment operations, listed on his internment list that there were approximately 6,000 from the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires, of which many were Ukrainian and Poles, some were Croats, others were Ruthenians, Slovaks, Czechs, Slovenians, and 2,000 were Germans. The remaining were also Turks and Bulgarians. Canada needed a means to fund the internment operations, and so a labor force was required and used to fund the camps, as well as for nation building projects. And so forced labor included land clearing by the blood, sweat, and tears of Canada's enemies, to provide homesteads for returning soldiers, also to build Canada's national parks, which not a lot of people are aware of. In order to legitimate the labor operations, the government found a clause in the Hague Convention, the 1907 Hague Convention, that prisoners could not or could only be compelled to work for their country as long as it did not benefit the war efforts. And so prisoners had to be treated with the same standards that Canada treated their own soldiers, where it came to food, shelter, clothing, etc. And so there needed to be this division between first and second class prisoners. First class prisoners typically were officers. They were provided with higher standards of food and shelter. They could not be compelled to work except for, for their own hygiene and comfort. But the division of internment camps here in Canada happened along ethnic lines. because there weren't really any military POWs here in Canada. And so General Otter felt that Germans were resourceful and intelligent. They posed a greater threat to Canada's national security. And so they were considered first-class prisoners and placed in confinement camps. Those from the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires were considered to be more of a simple-minded laboring class, and thus second-class prisoners, and were placed in these labor camps. But the 1907 Hague Convention really only applied to true prisoners of war or military POWs. And only 3,100 of all of these POWs across Canada could loosely be considered enemy reservists or even military POWs. The rest were civilian. The Morrissey Internment Camp was situated in an abandoned coal mining town in the town of Morrissey, which is located about 14 kilometers just outside of Fernie in southeastern British Columbia. It began as an illegal camp when the Fernie coal miners went on strike, refusing to work with the enemy aliens. And during this time, the unpopular Conservative provincial government, in an effort to regain popularity with the working or the laboring class, ordered the arrest of all single Austro-Hungarian and German menfolk in the Elk Valley, and then initially had interned them in Fernie proper, in the city itself. But the federal government did not support these illegal arrests and had only agreed to arrest military members, those who had risk of returning to the front lines. But the Fernie coal mine strikes created a domino effect, with other local coal mines quickly following suit. And so the federal government then became concerned about the potential for coal mine sabotage during the war effort, and agreed to intern and remove these prisoners and take over the Morrissey site. So the Morrissey camp would go on to continuously intern 400 Ukrainians and other Europeans from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, as well as German POWs during its 3 years in operation as a labor camp. So 400 UK prisoners a year it was holding. Today, there is very little evidence that remains on the landscape. Very little was known about Morrissey to, shed light onto this dark part of our Canadian history. It's also really interesting to note that the Canadian federal government's records had, until more recently, only acknowledged about 107 deaths that were recorded across these 24 internment camps. In Morrissey, there are 4 surviving marked graves, with 6 that were noted in the historical records. Historical documents also noted that there was a fever epidemic that ran through the camp in 1915. There was a flu that had incapacitated half of the camp in the winter of 1916. There was rampant tuberculosis and an influenza epidemic in 1918. And so this, along with the fact that Morrissey was rather notorious for the mistreatment that took place at this camp, Morrissey had received several note verbales, so verbal warnings from Germany, threatening retaliatory treatment with regards to Canadian and British POWs in Germany should conditions at this particular camp not improve. Interviews were undertaken in order to apply pertinent quotes that would contrast or support or provide new information to the historical record and also the material record. And there were really a number of themes that came to light during these interviews. And of note were, in particular, the abuse that took place in the camp, including even the court-martial of a 12-year-old boy whose rabbits had escaped and eaten all the vegetables in the camp garden. There were camp labor stories, prisoner complaints, as well as the common thread of shame, fear, and resentment towards the government regarding this internment. And so archival reports were also derived from the National and Provincial Archives, the Fernie Historical Society, local museums, newspapers, as well as from the POW descendants themselves. And on its own, each item, most of which were rather incomplete documents, only offered a piece of this historical puzzle. However, after compiling numerous documents or numerous fragments of these varying sources, several themes also came to light from these archives. And this was, in particular, the prisoner of war families that were living in Morrissey, even though we thought there were only men there. The escapes that happened, the description of the first and second class prisoners, the stories of it being a labor camp, and finally, the known deaths in Morrissey as well. So until now, it was thought that only 2 out of the 24 camps in Canada interned women and children. These were the Vernon Internment Camp as well as the Spirit Lake Internment Camp. But several Morrissey photographs surfaced as well that shed light onto the families that also lived alongside and spent much time within the camp quarters itself. And you can see in this photo here, this is within the second class quarters of the Morrissey Internment Camp. You can see the guard on the outside, and there's definitely a gentleman holding, a young toddler within the barbed wire fence itself. Although it was understood that there was this clear ethnic divide between the first and second class prisoners, as the camps began closing across Canada, and Germans, Ukrainians, and other Europeans from the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires became amalgamated within the same camps, and this visible divide between the prisoners also became apparent. One of the quotes from the archives said, "As a general rule of thumb, the ordinary prisoners, which would have been the Austro-Hungarians, were dressed in khaki overalls and a coat or jumper and flannel or flannelette shirts. The better class of prisoners, which were the first class Germans, wore cloth suits and negligee shirts with soft collars." And so even looking at the photos,
Sorry, Sarah, I'm just going to jump in. I think there's a problem with your mic being too close to your papers. Perhaps.
Sorry.
When you're flipping the papers, there's some noise being generated. I just wanted to jump in as you were flipping.
I will move that.
Okay, thank you so much. But continue, it's fascinating.
Essentially, there was, you can even see this significant visible divide between the first and second class prisoners within the camp. Several of these photographs surfaced as well that really shed light onto the families that also lived alongside, the prisoners. So the first and second class and whatnot. There was also violence within the camp. There was talk of the solitary confinement cells, which were common punishment, really, that were used to enforce the forced labor within the camp itself. The solitary confinement cells were often referred to as the black hole by the prisoners. There were cells that were 2 feet wide and 12 feet long. They contained no furniture with the exception of a swing down door for a bed. And the prisoners of war were also exposed to sleep deprivation with a bugler that sounded a horn every half hour for the first 2 days and on the hour for the following 2 days. And then, of course, once they were in solitary confinement, they were left with only bread and water as well. And these are straight from the military records. So we've now located we never actually located the solitary confinement cells when we were excavating, but we did locate the escape tunnel, and I will come back to that shortly. Until now, there's been very little archaeological work undertaken at World War I internment sites in general. In Canada, the Morrissey Internment Camp is, I would say, the most extensive excavation that's taken place to date. Upon its closure, and according to the government records, the camp had been completely dismantled. And so essentially they erased evidence of all the camps once they left. Often the wood, the fence posts, everything else were sold in town, the building windows and everything as well, to even take back money from the camp itself. And so at the start of the excavation that really formed the basis for this study, there was no surviving structures on the site. It was a really thick forested landscape, with the exception of one building, and this was the footprint of the second class prisoner of war building, known both as Big Building by the prisoners and also as the ice house, because it had been so cold in the winter. So here we moved beyond remote sensing. We started with ground penetrating radar, just to locate any of the building footprints that we could. And then we undertook excavations in both the first and second class prisoner of war compounds. This included the living quarters of the prisoners, their exercise yard, as well as the privies for the second class POWs. We also excavated in the camp canteen, which was located on the guard side of the camp. And this was used both by the prisoners and the guards. And so it was an interesting one to take a look at as well. And so this research, the excavation, really took a look at three specific aspects of the Morrissey POW life that can be observed or examined through the material record or through the artifacts. So I was really interested in examining what the material record could tell us about the prisoners' mental health, what was their state of mental health at the time, the various aspects of the resistance activities that took place in the camp, and then finally I was really interested in the prisoner of war diet. So we have continuously questioned how well the prisoners were fed, and to what extent did the military and government truly follow the 1907 Hague Convention? And through these excavations, we were really able to add a new dimension to the story. So this is a map that was created by the internment operations as part of the military records that we located in Library and Archives Canada. It was probably the only mapped documentation of Morrissey, other than a number of photos that we had to go off of as well. Initially, as I said, we used remote sensing, so we used ground penetrating radar to start looking for the building footprints. Then the next thing we did was go in and put 400 shovel tests in each of the areas and see what type of human activity would come up. And with this, that's how we were really able to locate the footprints of the first and second class compounds, to figure out where everything started and stopped, where the fence lines were, where the fence posts were. And one glaring difference that came up, archaeologically speaking, right off the bat, was the fact that porcelain shards were coming out in the first class prisoner of war compound, and none in the second class. And so we knew, even just from that there were, there was indoor plumbing and indoor washrooms for the German prisoners, of which there were very few. And then, of course, the privies, or the outhouses, for the second class prisoners of war. So this is one of the archival photographs that we have of the camp itself. The buildings on the right-hand side of the street were all from the guard side, and the buildings on the left, or the large one and one next to it, were the first and second class compounds for the prisoners. So the camp canteen is where that red arrow is. It was located on the guard side of the internment camp, directly across from the ice house, or a big building. And with this, the prisoners were able to use their monies that were earned through forced labor to purchase comfort items such as tobacco, sugar, or better quality soaps. And so prisoners were essentially paid for the work that they did. Half of that money was kept by the camp to pay for their basic needs, their basic food and lodging. The other half was paid to them, but out of that, they essentially kept a quarter, and the rest was put into a bank account to return to them after they were eventually released from prison. So that small building where the arrow is where the camp canteen was. And just to give you an idea of what it's like when we're excavating, that's the building floor of the camp canteen. These are undergraduate students that were, I had undergraduate students and graduate students from universities across Canada that were participating in the various excavations. And so we were very surprised, because the soil is very acidic there, and it's a very damp area. So we were really shocked at how preserved the floor was in this particular area. I also thought it was interesting that this particular sign, the London Life Insurance sign, this was located right on the floor when we were excavating down through the site. And the irony really shouldn't be lost on us. that you have an insurance sign for people in a concentration camp. Arts and handicrafts are often portrayed in the historical record as leisure activities that the prisoners took up. And several of the photographs that came up through the archives from Morrissey also had handwritten notes that explained, from the camp commanders and whatnot, that these were prisoners' pastimes. It was prisoners' leisure activities. And this image, often portrayed in newspapers during that time period, would only contribute to the already, existing ill feelings towards the enemy aliens. While the world was at war and lives were being lost, prisoners were portrayed as having, time to take part in such trivial aspects of daily life. But the quality of care that was afforded to these prisoners was often exaggerated when it was reported between the various governments, particularly to avoid the retaliatory treatment against Canada's POWs, in the Central Powers' hands. And so with this over-reliance on historical documents, it can really become rather easy to lose sight of this. And focusing on these leisure activities really negates the fact that the prisoners were forced into confinement. They left families behind, they left their homes behind, their work behind, all to face really an unknown fate while interned. And so instead, really the historical record needs to shift its lens from leisure activities such as arts and handicrafts, as is often written on these photographs, to really examine the methods that the prisoners used to cope behind barbed wire. In Morrissey, arts and handicrafts were a significant means for improving camp life and for keeping depression and ennui at bay. So the prisoners were gifted woodworkers. They were extremely skilled, either coming into the camp or developed these skills while they were at the camp prior to internment or during. And so here you've got, butterfly collections and paintings and ships and bottles and all these incredible aspects of life here in Morrissey. Handicrafts were really also another method that was used to pass the time. And so it would keep the mind occupied. It would help prisoners to develop new skills. For instance, they had an orchestra, they made their own instruments. So not only would it take time, for instance, to build board games or to build instruments, but then you were able to do something with these handicrafts after that. For instance, playing in the orchestra or learning how to play, a various game or whatnot. And so it really helped keep the mind occupied. It helped to build self-esteem. It also helped to create these social bonds amongst the prisoners. And so crafting was really undertaken with the intention of passing time, but also to create items that could be used repeatedly once they were complete, such as, the board games and the instruments. They also improved the prisoners' living environments, which we often see in the photographs with the various paintings that were in, the buildings, the prisoners' buildings, also on the guard side of the camp as well. And they would use these to either sell to gain money or traded for, to acquire new things or given as a thank you to somebody. And so they really became a method of payment in one way or another. They would also be used, or the monies that they were getting for selling, various arts and handicrafts could also be used in the camp canteen to buy the extra things that they weren't provided with, as they were only given basic necessities such as chocolate or food or different seasonings, better soap, and sometimes even alcohol within the camps. The prisoners at Morrissey also engaged in various means of resistance activities to really protest the false imprisonment. In Europe, military prisoners of war interned during the First World War, if they felt, they often held these deferring attitudes towards captivity. If they regarded captivity as the termination of combat, then they were more likely to accept their fate and not resist. And so often acts of passive and principled resistance were more likely to be undertaken in these types of cases. But those that felt that captivity was merely a detour in the continuation of battle, those would often find ways to sabotage the enemy, and ultimately attempt escape and return to the front lines. And so for them, it was a patriotic duty. It was a sign of, direct resistance, and resistance was an absolute need. But this is really where the Canadian internment prisoner of war population differs greatly from the Ws that were captured on the front lines in Europe. The majority of the Canadians were not military personnel. And so as internees, they were not fighting for their countries, but for their basic civil rights and liberties, and in many cases, just to survive. And so this was not a patriotic fight, and it's not surprising that principled resistance was the most common form of defiance at the Morrissey camp. Although more generally, strikes and riots had the potential to lead to positive action within a camp, these did very little to affect change for the Morrissey prisoners. Instead, with this type of resistance, the internees were beaten and placed in solitary confinement cells, placed on these restricted diets, which would obviously strongly discourage any further or any future outbursts. And these confinement cells were used often, as noted in the numerous prisoner of war correspondence that we've read through. The military records also talk about the camp conditions and how, or the prisoner aspects of these records talk about the camp conditions and how dire that these dwellings were, that the prisoners would risk punitive action in their attempts to ameliorate the confinement conditions. And so these prisoners really became sophisticated in their resistance activities, often secreting letters, to the Swiss consul, for instance, who on one occasion forwarded a letter directly to Germany to avoid Canadian censorship. And so these notverbals that were common from Germany would warn the British government that retaliation against British and Canadian prisoners of war on German soil would be swift should these conditions at Morrissey in particular not improve. And so Canada and Great Britain really took these threats seriously, and concessions were then made at the Morrissey camp. So for instance, with the ice house, when the heat, they had to ameliorate this prison conditions so that there was better heat in that building, as one example. Passive resistance, such as rebellion hidden in plain sight, for example, in the artwork and handicrafts, really allowed the prisoners to rebel. It also helped to boost camp morale while remaining undetected and also avoiding any disciplinary action. And I often think that the prisoners really must have felt a personal victory when, the Morrissey personnel would photograph these items and document these handicrafts. The feeling of outsmarting one's opponent would have offered a psychological boost to prisoners that were locked in this power struggle with the guards. And so this is a patchwork quilt. It has international flags on it that the prisoners had sewn in. The majority of these flags are Entente or neutral flags, but if you look at the bottom, you can see the largest one is the Iron Cross, and there's also a small one at the top as well. In this photograph, a seemingly innocuous life ring reads SM Boot. I think I circled it. Yes, SM Boot G134 torpedo. And I passed this photograph a number of times, and one day it just caught my eye, and I thought something needs to be researched about this. And by investigating it, I realized that it belonged to a German S9E class large torpedo boat. So whether this prisoner was a mariner who had served on the ship or had made it for someone who had, there was obviously a definitive link on some level to this class of German warship, really making it likely that this POW may have been a potential combatant rather than a civilian POW in Morrissey. Framing the painting with this specifically labeled life ring really was a way for this particular prisoner to clearly demonstrate support for Germany and the Central Powers, while really going unnoticed. This is a German newspaper print. This was excavated from the bottom, the very bottom, so about 6 or 7 feet down of one of the prisoner of war privy, or the second class prisoner of war privy. And it was shocking that even this much survived of it. So the translation, the words that remain say Austria, Northwest, Bulgarians, Germans, into the and into the houses. And so there was a lot of contraband in the second class quarters that we were able to excavate, anything from shanks to alcohol, which would have been contraband, particularly after 1917 with prohibition, and of course this newspaper print. And the limited wording really appears to discuss the current events of the war. And given the fact that POW letters were rigidly censored, it seems rather improbable that information pertaining to the front lines in the war, especially in German, was able to legally enter the camp. But escape was the ultimate form of resistance. And although attempts were numerous, success was not in Morrissey. And at many of the other camps as well. Prisoners risked being shot or dying from exposure, as many of the camps remained, in the outskirts and the really far regions away from local populations. In Europe, escape committees were common amongst prisoners. They were often set up the moment, a camp was populated. Prisoners, especially with specialized skill sets that were useful for tunneling, would be recruited immediately. And so similarly in Morrissey, as well as at other camps in British Columbia and Alberta, anyone who had previous mining experience became an asset, and they were highly sought after. And so notably, some of the earliest prisoners had previously worked in the local coal mines when they had been arrested. Escape in Morrissey across the border into the United States was rather common until the US entered the war in 1917. And the Morrissey camp was located about 45 kilometers from the Canada-US border. And so it was really ideally situated for a large-scale tunnel escape to be executed in early 1917. However, as with the case with many internment camps, this one unfortunately did not succeed. In the internment camps in BC alone, there were five escape tunnels that were built. 3 of those escapes were not successful. Only 2 of the tunnels were successful for prisoner escapes. But it's interesting to note with the escapes that did happen, they both happened at the Lethbridge internment camp, which is also, out west. And both of these occurred through the first class compounds and not the second class compounds. And so, although unsuccessful attempts did take place in the second class compounds at Lethbridge, at Yoho, at the Morrissey Internment Camp, these tended to happen because first class prisoners, not being compelled to work, had time to really focus and plan the escapes to execute the tunnels perfectly, whereas the second class prisoners found themselves laboring, all day and only had time at night to start digging these tunnels and to plan the escapes, to stow away the various foods and items that they would need to be successful. And so it was much more physically and psychologically demanding for second class prisoners to dedicate any time to planning and executing tunnels in general. So this is some of my grad students This is the surface that's been worn down because we were walking on it. We located the escape tunnel with the ground penetrating radar and then started laying out our grids to excavate it. So in 2016, we located the escape tunnel, and the tunnel really spoke to the mindset of the prisoners that were willing to dig for months on end to escape, imprisonment in Morrissey. In Morrissey, as I said, the escape was not successful. It was the tunnel was discovered the night before the escape was to happen. If it had happened, it's likely that the entire group of 300 prisoners would have been able to escape across the border into the US. But that unfortunately didn't happen. And when the tunnel was discovered, there were reports that there were near riots within the camp itself. And so we located the tunnel with ground penetrating radar. The GPR was provided to me with a very generous grant from the Canadian First World War Internment Recognition Fund. As you can see here, it looks very similar to a lawnmower. And what it does is it emits electromagnetic waves into the ground. And when it pings on something, you're measuring the velocity. So the distance, the time it takes to hit an object, and measures the distance back to the surface. So these are the results from the actual escape tunnel in Morrissey. So with this picture here, it's what we call a plan profile view. And it's a top-down view. So you can go down, take a bird's eye view and go down incrementally in centimeters to examine exactly what's beneath the earth. So the colors here are arbitrary. Red just means that that's the deepest level of soil disturbance, and blue means that there's very little soil disturbance in that particular area. This is when we started to we began digging the escape tunnel itself. And as we move through it, you can see how the GPR results really corroborate the various aspects of the tunnel itself. And so we opened up these 3 cross sections of the tunnel, and this is where we ended up, where we discovered numerous food items. Often, prisoners would stow away the supplies that they would need to be able to survive that trek through a forested, uninhabited landscape in the winter across the border. So there were numerous food items, inkwells, many things. But what was interesting about it is that there was a lot of glass that had been melted. And what we think happened is once the tunnel had been discovered, the guards had filled it not only with what was already in there, but likely, a bunch of other camp garbage, and burned it, and burned the shoring as well, to ensure that there was no way that this tunnel could be used again in the future. What was interesting about the tunnel as well is that the Fernie Free Press, which was the local newspaper at the time, talks about the prisoners digging a tunnel, but it was not outside the back of the building, it was outside the front of the building, and how these prisoners were not that smart because they were digging it, and when the camp guards discovered it, they were halfway to tunneling towards the guards' quarters, where they would have been immediately discovered. And the irony is, when we discovered the tunnel itself, it was actually located outside the back of the building, right along the fence line, where escape would have been immediate. They would not have been discovered in any way. Had we not discovered the tunnel and only relied on the historical documents for these newspaper reports, we wouldn't have known where the prisoners had exactly, or where they had planned to escape from. So in order to delve deeper into my third question, which was the prisoner of war diet, we initially relied on documentary evidence that was examined from the Auditor General's War Appropriation Reports. And these are a group of sessional papers that describes the monetary expenditures that were applied to the prisoners of war during the Canadian internment operations. I also studied or looked at the Canadian military files, and of course the notes of protest that came from the prisoners themselves. And then, of course, finally, the relevant material culture, the artifacts. So the numerous food tins and animal bones that were excavated, not only from the camp canteen, but also the escape tunnel, and then the two privies that were located in the second-class quarters. Out of all the areas that we had excavated, the privies in the second-class compound ended up being really the most fruitful. Ironically, for an archaeologist, a privy really is like looking into a time capsule. So privies are locations where personal items are accidentally dropped or contraband is hidden. It's also a place where household waste disposal, such as broken plates, glasses and other garbage, or foodstuffs from the kitchen, are easily disposed of. And so privies really tell us quite a bit about the lives of the individuals that use them. And so this is one of the privies that we were excavating, and the picture on the right has Holly, one of my great archaeologists, and that is the number of animal bones that we had bagged from different levels that came out of one single privy. So the prisoners of war disposed of food waste into these privies. In total, we analyzed 4,000 animal bones that we had excavated from these two privies. And then we undertook a faunal analysis. So this was undertaken in order to gain insight into the diet itself. We were interested in this because, as I previously noted, the historical record is not always accurate. And we had come across numerous reports where the prisoners were complaining about either, the poor food or the lack of food in the camp. And so, for example, one of the prisoners had attempted to contact the Swiss consul about the lack of food, but his letter was immediately censored. And he wrote that in the month of July last, our rations have been reduced to starvation. And this letter had been handed back to him with a request to strike out that portion. And so he wrote another letter, which was forwarded to the Swiss consul, leaving, the important information out of it. In another letter, it was noted that the cooks complain that the food supply is insufficient and the beef often arrives in bad condition. They stated that 2 lots of beef, one of 10 pounds and one of 52 pounds, have been returned as unfit for consumption. And then, of course, there was a note from the commandant at the time in Morrissey that he had written to one of the staff officers. And he noted, "I do not consider it advisable to let prisoners have scales, like food scales, in the kitchen. This is only asked for to enable them to check up on their rations as issued and would lead to all kinds of trouble." And so for us excavating, the faunal analysis noted that the privy assemblages contained a number of animal types. So it contained cow, it contained pig, it contained sheep, it contained goat. Interestingly enough, it contained a single rooster. But along with this, these privies also contained mule deer, wild turkey, and also grizzly, or parts of a grizzly. And so the most significant change that we noted from this excavation was that the diet, observed between 1916 and 1917 and 1917 and 1918, so between this 2-year period, this diet had really changed significantly. So within the wartime appropriation reports, where we were getting the amounts of foods from the government that were being fed to the prisoners, it was documented that there was a 27,000 pound reduction in meat that was entering the camp during that period. And this, for me, what flagged me, because it's a really significant amount of food reduction, particularly when in that particular time period, 80 additional prisoners had been added to the camp itself. And so when we did the excavation and started to analyze these animal bones, what it revealed was that there was actually a 52% increase in bovine or cow bones. There was also a 64% increase in caprine or sheep bones during the same 2-year period. But this isn't actually all that surprising, because if you increase lower quality cuts of meat, this would result in an increase in, the bone quantity as well. In June of 1917, Canada began experiencing, the food shortage, and rationing was essentially imposed in the camp as well. My thoughts are that this was actually merely an excuse that was provided to the POWs for the food reduction that was happening in the camp at the time. So on paper, it really appeared as a reasonable explanation for why there was a food reduction within the camp. It's also impossible, we'll never be able to say from the particular faunal assemblage whether the meat arrived in poor or rotten condition, because we can only analyze the bones that we have. But an examination of this particular faunal assemblage really can confirm that there was this definitive increase in cheaper cuts of meat and a decline in the better quality of meats as time went on in the camp. And so many of the cow bones and the sheep bones, or the long bones from them, also exhibited these transverse breaks, or these saw cut marks on the shaft of the bones as well. And it's a butchery practice that's really common with the extraction of the nutrient-rich bone marrow, which would have added, much needed sustenance and aiding in, strengthening immunity and whatnot in the camp. And so not only was there this reduction in meat supply, the faunal assemblage and the war measures appropriation reports also demonstrate that the camp diet lacked variety in food as well. And so it's not surprising that these prisoners were supplementing their diets with the wild meats, such as the mule deer, the wild turkey, and of course the grizzly bear. So the bones that were excavated from these privies in the second class compound essentially would have augmented their diets in different ways with the wild meats. The wild meats were likely purchased in some way or traded with locals. We have a photograph of somebody bringing a cart of mule deer into the camp. The wild turkey was likely snared within the compound itself. Where the grizzly bear came from is anyone's guess. But what is evident is that both the war measures appropriation reports and the excavation really shows that there were reductions in food in Morrissey. So, as I said, increasing this supply of bone-in and poor quality cuts of meat, by doing this, the internment operations would have been able to essentially limit the supply of meat coming into the camp, while outwardly appearing not to make these dramatic reductions, because on paper the meat weights would have been fairly similar. And so the prisoners complained throughout their imprisonment about the lack of food, about the poor food or the quality of the food entering the camp. But on paper, the war measures appropriation reports really showed that there was conformity to the 1907 Hague Convention. So, for example, during the second year that the camp was in operation, 100,000 pounds of meat was brought in to feed approximately 160 prisoners of war. This does appear to be an exorbitant amount of food for the prisoners. It would average to about 1.9 pounds of meat per individual per day. And so really the prisoners' complaints would therefore appear rather baseless. And so without this faunal analysis and this excavation that took place, that can offer additional insight into the types of cuts of meat that were provided, and also the quality of the meat that was being provided, really the total amount of meat in proportion to bone, one could just easily assume that the prisoners were fed extremely well, and this was not the case. It's also interesting to note that, from the excavation, coffee, sugar, and fats, so butter, it would have been oleomargarine at that time, and lard, items that were on Canada's food ration list, were not limited in the Morrissey camp. And so it's quite likely that sugars and fats were used to supplement what was otherwise lacking calorically in the prisoner's diet. And furthermore, rationing only specific items that were on the Canada's food ration list was likely a ruse that was used to cut camp costs instead, while appearing to follow the Hague Convention rather than truly honoring Canada's food rationing that was taking place at that time. And so the question becomes, why is the excavation significant? And I would say it's because history is written by the victors, and thus the stories of the oppressed are often ignored. And as time passes, these disenfranchised groups are often forgotten. They're erased from history. The material record, these artifacts that were excavated from the Morrissey Internment Camp, these can be used to corroborate or counter the written historical record and essentially right a historical wrong. Today, as we know, there are very few Canadians that are aware of the Canadian internment operations from World War I, let alone Morrissey, where very few people know about it. There's no trace of it on the abandoned, landscape. It's an abandoned coal mining town. It remains extremely well hidden on the landscape. It's forested. It's been completely reclaimed by the environment itself. And so I should actually go back and say this is the Morrissey Cemetery. So this is you can see 3 of the surviving prisoner of war graves. And so after our excavation was complete, we took part in a community cleanup to clean up the area and try and help restore it. We actually ended up replacing these fences and having a commemoration ceremony there and prayers at the end of that excavation a couple of years ago. So if we're looking at changing this dialogue, one of the most significant finds that came out of the privy in the second-class POW compound was this cross that was made out of barbed wire. The cross remains a powerful image of what prisoners endured. The cross is a symbol of faith. It's created out of barbed wire, the boundary that separated these prisoners from freedom. So 2 of these artifacts now, you can see the barbed wire cross there. The other one is a handmade shovel that was used. We found it in the escape tunnels. So one can assume that it was used to dig that escape tunnel. These are now on exhibit in the Canadian Museum of History, and actually all of the artifacts from that excavation are now at the Canadian Museum of History. And so these remain tangible objects. They are talking points. They open the conversation of Canada's World War I internment operations, and they create awareness with the public for years to come. And in doing so, we can hopefully prevent such an injustice from happening today. And so this research really reveals, this is the exhibit, but it really reveals a double-edged sword. While Canadians remember and commemorate freedom and sacrifice on the battlefield, a darker side of history must not be forgotten, where foreigners on Canadian soil were forced to sacrifice in the name of Canadian nation building. History repeated itself again in World War II with Japanese internment camps on Canadian soil. And as several interviewees noted during my research, with current global events, it can very easily happen again. And so it's really important to create this awareness and to motivate change. Thank you. I'll leave you with just a few photos of some of the other artifacts that came out of the camp.
Sarah, thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation and quite stunning, I think, to see some of these artifacts that you've uncovered, and the barbed wire cross is very moving. I have one question for you to get started, but I want to ask if anyone has questions about Dr. Beaulieu's talk, to please post them in chat or raise your hand. I'm struck by this discrepancy between the various texts, the documentation that we tend to rely on in our culture so much for proof of things. It's got to be a text. and what you've actually found. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about these discrepancies between what gets recorded and then becomes that we rely on as fact, and what you've learned about, how you learn about what actually happens. If you could talk about that and how it makes you think about, documentation processes in general as we have them today.
Absolutely. Well, it's a hard one because the Western lens really is to rely on documentation, and we tend to forget, particularly in war, that history is written by the victors. As far as Canadian internment operations went, and with any country that was at war, you're of course going to say that the POWs that are on your soil, you are looking after, so that there's no retaliatory treatment with your citizens on other soil. And so there was, very good reason for, in a sense, to make sure that this documentation aligned with that, which is why I thought it was really important to go in and excavate. Really, it's historical forensics.
Mm-hmm.
And taking a look at these aspects and putting these pieces of a puzzle together and I wasn't necessarily going in to corroborate or to counter historical records, but if you're going to use an unbiased lens when you're taking a look at it and you start to see that some things are not lining up, for example, the escape tunnel being in the right direction and not, digging towards the guards.
Well, and we've got a number of questions that people have. People are curious about some of these histories and how they might relate to their own ancestors. But I did want to ask again. There's been a long history of shame. We talk often about the shame that is associated with this internment camp process that Ukrainians have held. And I know that this story in was it the Vernon newspaper about the location of the tunnel, or it was what newspaper was it?
The Fernie newspaper.
The Fernie newspaper, talking about the stupidity of the prisoners, and we are familiar with that stereotype that existed, I would say, up until through the 1980s, even of the stupid Ukrainian, and I'm wondering, sort of. How much, what are the reasons why Ukrainians didn't, in your mind, didn't talk about this as much as, say, arguably Japanese Canadians did after their experience of being interned in World War II? Because we're still, it's been going on for a few years now, but there's still just a process of discovery. People haven't known about these camps in World War I.
I think, well,
and how does that relate to the shame? Sorry, that's my question.
Times had changed a little bit by the Second World War. I think during the First World War, this was really the first significant internment that was happening around Europe since, the Boer War and whatnot. And I think it was hard for all the internees to try and explain what was happening to them and the hardships that were happening here when you've lost so much family in Europe. And people in Europe didn't believe what was happening here. This is Canada, and because it wasn't very open and it wasn't documented in the same way, I think the shame is because of that. How do you explain to your wife and family where you've been for the last number of years and haven't been able to provide for them? I think it's multi-layered. There's many levels to it. And then, of course, when it's not talked about, and then by the time grandchildren discover it, it's almost too late. To try and find the story.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a few questions here. Do we have an idea of how many children were born in the camps, and did you find anything related to that at Morrissey? Were there families there? There's a photo of a child. So often with the camps, women and children would move alongside the camps and live there, where there could be additional supports for them. Morrissey, there weren't women and children that were living in the camps. It turns out they were living alongside as well. So there were no children per se that were actually born in the Morrissey camp, because Morrissey was an all men's camp. So the children were allowed in, I'm assuming, at certain times and whatnot, but not born in the camp. Okay. And then what about TB? Is there a way of discovering evidence about TB circulating in the camps?
There was a significant amount of tuberculosis that went through all the camps. Tuberculosis, Spanish flu, influenza. And so when we had done ground penetrating radar in the Internee Cemetery, there were four known graves, but there are up to 20 additional depressions that are suspected graves as well. That we will never know unless somebody wants, there's a lot of legal aspects around excavation, and if you even want to disturb remains or not, but it's
Right.
quite probable that those are additional burials from likely one of the influenzas that went through.
Mhm. And so we have another question about whether or not you plan to do any more excavation at the Morrissey camp or any other internment camps in Canada.
I would love to continue with Morrissey. I feel like we could spend another 10 years in there. And Morrissey is the size of a small town. It's 6 streets, 4 avenues. It's large. And I think we could keep going easily for a decade. We did move to the Morrissey Internment Camp just outside of Vernon, where we spent a couple of weeks just trying to figure out what was there. And Morrissey is interesting because it was a very temporary camp. It was only open for a couple of months. And based on those archival photographs, it was a very, very small camp. Halfway through that excavation, as we were doing, a landscape analysis and walking through different aspects of the forest, we discovered an entire side of the camp that's not even in the historical documents anymore, and it's easily the size of Morrissey. So I hope that we continue to excavate these camps, because it will continue to tell the story, offer new evidence and more nuance to what we do know.
Mhm. I have one more question from chat, and then we have a hand up. How do you know there was an orchestra apart from photos of instruments? And do you know what kind of music was played?
Don't know what type of music. That's merely from the archives, but I do know that there was a significant amount of woodworking that did go on at the camp, because of all the wood files that we found in one of the areas of the internee quarters. So you start piecing all of this together, but it's just there were a number of archival photographs of the prisoner of war orchestra. I think it was the YMCA that was providing some type of reprieve to the prisoners, and there was a photograph of them playing Christmas music at one point.
Interesting. For people interested in the music of the internment camps, the Vancouver-based musician Beverly Dobrinsky has done some research on the songs that were sung by Ukrainians in the internment camps, and we are working with her to create a podcast. So you can keep your eyes on our website for that. Over the next year, let's say, there'll be some stuff coming out there. And then we have a hand up, Mark Minenko.
Hi, Sarah.
Hello, Dr. Manenko.
Sarah and I go back a few years.
I figured.
I just wanted to, just for fun, just to give you a context, I just finished a couple of years ago a doctorate at King's College London, England, on this topic, looking at emergency legislation and civil liberties. So I found your question about the shame aspect interesting. And I know in presentations I've done in Canada, I've often had people come up to me and say, even when I was in elementary school in the 60s, I had teachers punish us physically for speaking Ukrainian in the hallways or even in the playgrounds. So this is a thing that certainly carried on. I was looking forward to Sarah's presentation on the rations and the food that was provided and what she found. And I think she's done very valuable work, because it sort of meshes with some of the things that have been found. Like she started off by advising everybody that the records were destroyed, and those were the records of the Internment Operations Office. Now, I found close to 150,000 records that were not destroyed. And it paints a very interesting picture. Like, for example, on the issue of bones, um, the rations that were provided, there was a certain amount of money that was allowed per prisoner of war per day. And in 1917, if I remember correctly, there was an order to reduce the amount by 5 cents or 6 cents per prisoner. And what did happen is, as Sarah found, cheaper meats were ended up being supplied by some of the vendors who had tender agreements with various internment camps. And these complaints actually were filed up and they were addressed. So I'm not sure, and Sarah and I will probably have to chat offline to see how much along what time frame she found it, because I know in some of the other internment camps, when the Ottawa office and General Otter found out about this, they started going after the companies like Burns Meats, who often provided food to to different camps and so on. So just a couple of points, if I could interject as well. The Germans were not designated as first-class citizens. There were many, many, many Germans who were second-class, not citizens, but prisoners of war. And there were a number of Austrians that were first class. And so it wasn't necessary. And this all gears to the military way of addressing things. For example, I spent 36 years in the Canadian military as an officer, and we were treated differently than the non-commissioned officers. And this was something that is a long-standing several hundred-year tradition in British military history and in all militaries around the world. Hence, it ends up in the Hague Convention. And if your listeners are interested, I'm just finishing up a second book looking at Canadian compliance with the terms of the Hague Conventions. And I've just finished my second draft, and I'm going to be looking at securing a publisher for it shortly, kind of thing. So, and this is where I look at exactly these points and things, and again, obviously, there's room for a series of books to explain the different camps in the different provinces, and none of that has really been done. And I certainly welcome any of your listeners today. If they want to contact me, I know Sarah's got my email, or yourself. I've got a number of lists that I've indicated.
Sure. Would you like to just put your email address in the chat so people can grab it now if they'd like?
Yeah, sure.
Otherwise, you can send it to me and people can write to the museum. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I'm not with the museum.
No, yeah, you could write to me at the museum, and they can.
So anyways, I put it on right now. So but yeah, this was great. Thank you very much, Sarah. It's you've done some valuable and interesting work in the mud.
Literally in the dirt. I have to say I owe a debt to Mark. Mark is a lawyer who did, correct me if I'm wrong when I say it wrong, Mark, but you did a PhD in internment law in England. And when I went to defend my PhD, the external would not accept it because he did not believe that we had internment camps here in Canada.
Oh my goodness.
And because it was a labor camp, not an internment camp. And, Canada was rather unique in the way that it had run this operation. And Mark is the one that found me the legal document to be able to submit it just to move forward. Otherwise, the entire thesis would have crumbled. So,
and see, what's very interesting is there were internment camps throughout not only the British Empire, but also in literally every world. Every aspect of the world. For example, the Samoa Islands, if anybody's gone to the South Pacific, there were internment camps there. But what's very interesting, I found, is the Canadian internment camps were run by a military officer who actually was concerned not only for the welfare of the guards, but the welfare of the prisoners of war. And as opposed to places like in England that started interning literally everybody within days of the war starting, that didn't happen in Canada. I believe half the alien enemy population in the UK was interned at one time or another in the UK. The same thing in Australia. It was even worse in Australia, where you had grandchildren of people who had come from Germany or from Croatia being interned, even though they were already the second generation Australians. So, so you sort of, and part of the second book talks about this context of and comparing, even in South Africa, what the internment was like there, or in the Caribbean. In fact, one of the funniest things I found in the British records was one of the British officials wrote on a cover page about the camp in Bermuda. And this is like about 1916. He says, "This sounds like a wonderful place for a holiday."
Oh, gosh.
Anyways, so, but sorry, I've gone a little long, but thank you very
But
much.
you'll have to
for
keep us informed of those books, and we'll get them in our gift shop here. We have another very good question for Dr. Beaulieu. How does this work inform reconciliation efforts, especially with regards to residential schools, the legacy of residential schools?
The irony is the effort I put into the residential school research and the methods that I'm using are the exact same things that I've been using with this internment camp research. And reconciliation has been on, I think, numerous levels with these types of excavations, in large part because of the Canadian First World War Internment Recognition Fund, which is unfortunately coming to an end. But with grants that have supported research, to disseminating information, to getting it out there within our education systems where people are finally learning about it. Reconciliation is about people have to know about it and hear about it and acknowledge it in order for us to be able to move forward. It can't happen without that.
So as you do this work, are your technologies improving too? Is that part of it? Do you incrementally kind of learn things about how to use the technology, or developing the technology to help these excavations go better?
Excavations haven't really changed.
Okay.
They're rather scientific in the way that you can think of it as almost forensic in that sense, in the way you're laying out grids and whatnot. As far as remote sensing, have things changed? Equipment, as technology and computers do, changes and improves over time. But not significant. I think once you learn to operate the machines, it's that part is the interpretation part of it. It always remains the same. I sit on several national committees for the archaeology work, reconciliation work, remote sensing work, and we're all working through it.
If there are any final questions, I'd ask people to post them now. We did discuss this a little bit before we went live tonight, but I'm struck by how much the land can tell us. And there are so many places, even in Canada, we think of so many wilderness places as pristine. And of course, they've been inhabited by humans since time immemorial, and then even in modern times. Things have taken place there, and then nature overgrows it. And so what the land can give us in terms of knowledge is also these even modern histories. And it's amazing. And I think we all take for granted that what's on the surface is what's there. And your work really shows us how that is never true, basically. So we don't have any further questions. So I want to thank you, Dr. Beaulieu, for your speaking with us tonight. It was really, really powerful to see what you've learned there, and to get a kind of more tangible relationship to one of these internment camps through your images and through your talk. So I want to thank you for that. I want to thank all the people who came online to join us tonight. Our next live online lecture on the internment camps is taking place on February 22nd at 7 p.m. CST, and that is That is with Dr. Baudin Cordin, and his talk is called Political Ethics and the Policy and Practice of World War II Internment in Canada. And before we go, for any of you who are here in Saskatoon, I'm not sure there's many, tomorrow as part of Saskatchewan Archives Week, we will be spinning discs from our collection of old Ukrainian Canadian musical albums and serving coffee, tea, and treats all day long from 10 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. So if you are in town, I invite you to stop by, say hello, and join us. Thank you once again, Dr. Beaulieu. Your work is really important. We look forward to books from you and more talks in the future. We really appreciate your presence here tonight. So thank you, Diakuyu and Doranic, everybody.
Thank you for having me.